In this video, we're going to demonstrate how to set valve lash on bucket lifters. And a bucket lifter basically looks like this. You can see where it gets its name from. And it sits on top of the valve. So here we've got a valve that's already installed with the valve spring, and it drops right on top of the valve like this. And the camshaft sits on top of that. And as the cam lobe comes around, it pushes directly on the bucket lifter. The valve lash in these cases, on this type of a lifter, is referring to the space between the bottom of this cam lobe and the top of the lifter. In most instances, there should be some space, and we need to measure that. If the lash is too great, you'll end up with a ticking noise in your engine when it's idling. And if the lash is too small, you can end up with a leaking valve or low compression because the valve is being held open and it's not closing. We have to remember that when the engine heats up, everything expands, and so any clearance that we measure now will decrease as the engine warms up, and so that's why we have a specification and need to measure this. So, for starters, there are three basic types of bucket lifters. So, right here is an example of a hydraulic bucket lifter. It's got a hydraulic plunger in it. I can squeeze that and I can see the oil coming out of the hole here, and I can compress it. And these hydraulic lifters actually don't need to be adjusted. You can see I can push that oil out of that hydraulic lifter. As long as we've set up the valve so that the installed height is within specification, there's often no adjustment. We have a type like this, which is solid. This is off of a Toyota, and it's a solid lifter. Now these lifters come in different thicknesses, but often the only way to adjust these is to grind the tips of the valve. There is no other way to adjust them. And the third type is like this. It's a solid lifter steel, but it has a shim on top. You'll notice I can spin this shim around, and you can pull this shim out. Now, this one's been out before. If they haven't been out before, you'll have to use a little screwdriver or pick right there to break it loose. But once they're out, you can pull it out with a magnet. And these shims can be adjusted. We can either move shims around so that we have thinner shims in different spots or thicker shims, or we can actually take the bottom of the shim and grind a little bit of material off. So, let's go over here to our specifications. You'll find a valve lash specification like this. For this particular engine, the intake valve lash is 7 to 11 thousandths of an inch. And the exhaust valve lash is usually different, and it's 11 to 15 thousandths of an inch. Just to take a look at a different engine, this is one of those hydraulic valves, and on valve lash here it just says hydraulic, so there is no adjustment or any clearance specification for that one. So what I would do here is I would pick, I've got 7 to 11 thousandths of an inch, so I would find my 7 thousandths feeder gauge, and I'd find my 12 thousandths, so one that's just larger than the largest. Then I've also pulled out the 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 gauges because I'll probably use those. Most of the time after you've worked on a cylinder head, the valve lash is smaller than specification, because if you've ground the valve seats or the valve faces, then the valve sits higher into the cylinder head and the lash has decreased. So let's come over here. Let's take an intake valve. Now what you want to do is only put one in at a time. You want to do this. Some people will bolt the head down or bolt the camshaft down every single time and check and then pull it back apart. But on this type with a shim, we'll just drop the lifter down into here. We'll bring the camshaft over. Make sure that's the only lifter in the head here so that it doesn't hold the camshaft up. We'll set the camshaft down so that the lobes are up. Notice that it's sitting all the way down into the bore and nothing is holding the cam up. I would come over here and I would check the 12 thousandths, and it shouldn't fit, and it doesn't. Be careful that if you push too hard, you can lift the camshaft up. So just check that it won't go in by gently pushing. And then I'll check the 7. Now if it's in spec, the 7 should fit because this is the smallest clearance that's acceptable. But it doesn't fit either, so our valve lash is smaller than specification, so that's why we'll pull out these smaller gauges here. Just randomly check, let's check a 5. The 5 fits, but it's lifting the cam just a little bit, so I'm going to check the 4. And the 4 glides through really nicely. So this clearance right now is 4/1000ths of an inch. Back to our specification over here. We need to get between 7 and 11, so I'm going to pick a number in the middle. We're going to say 9/1000ths. So to get from 4/1000ths to the 9 where we want to be, we're going to have to take off 5/1000ths of an inch. Back to the engine. There are 2 possible ways to do it here. One way to do this is to take the valve back out and grind the 5/1000ths of an inch off the top of the valve stem. The other way is to take this shim out and replace it with another shim that is 5/1000ths thinner, or if you have the appropriate grinding tools or machining tools, like a surface grinder, we can flip this upside down. We don't want to grind off of the top where the cam lobe contacts it. We'd flip it upside down, and we would take 5/1000ths of an inch off of this shim, drop it back into the lifter and back into the head, and recheck it, and it should be within specification now. Now I want to show you one more. On this type of lifter here, this is off of another engine. This does not have the removable shim. So the only ways that you can adjust this one are by moving lifters around, so replacing thicker ones with thinner ones until you can get as many as possible to fit, or to take the lifter out and grind off the top of the valve. And to do that, you don't need to actually install the valve springs every single time. You can do like we've done here and just install the valve, and you would of course use your hand to make sure that the valve is all the way seated against the seat. Then we could drop the lifter on top of that valve and then put the camshaft in and check it. So you don't have to fully assemble the valve every time, because obviously we're going to be taking the valve back out and grinding some off the tip to make that fit. Anyway, that's how you'd set up the valve lash. Again, you want to kind of shoot for the middle of the range and use your feeler gauge. Always have the gauge out that's just larger than the largest specification to make sure that it's not too wide, because you'll regret it if you have too much clearance, and when the engine starts you'll hear the ticking noise and have to take it back apart again.